was 25 years before the truth began its slow, agonizing climb from the depths of the Montana wilderness. 25 years of silence, 25 years of dread, 25 years of a chilling, profound mystery that had swallowed 5 vibrant lives whole. The year was 1978, and the 5 members of the Missoula Mountaineering Club, young, confident, and brimming with the reckless optimism of their age, set out for the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Bitterroot Range. They were experienced, not novices. They understood the mountains, or so they believed. They carried the best gear of the era, meticulously checked and double-checked. They had filed their itinerary, a challenging multi-day traverse, culminating in a final push for the summit of a minor, unnamed peak, a last triumphant gesture before the descent. Yet when the day came for their scheduled return, the parking lot remained eerily empty, the old pickup truck the only silent sentinel waiting for an arrival that would never come. This was the opening act of a tragedy that would haunt the region for a generation. The initial assumption was simple, brutal, and utterly wrong. It was thought a sudden blizzard, an unexpected rock slide, or perhaps a navigational error had claimed them, leaving their bodies entombed beneath tons of snow and stone. The mountains, after all, always hold the ultimate, terrible authority. An immediate search was launched, vast in scope, but frustratingly limited by the sheer scale of the terrain. Teams of seasoned rescuers scoured the trails and slopes, their helicopters buzzing like angry hornets over the granite teeth of the range. They found nothing. No broken branches, no discarded wrappers, no telltale boot prints. It was as if the earth itself had opened up and swallowed the entire expedition. The initial hope, that stubborn, irrational belief in a miracle, slowly, painfully, gave way to a cold, sinking dread. The families gathered in a small, wood-paneled office at the local sheriff's department, listened to the grim reports, the investigator speaking with professional detachment that could not fully mask the hopelessness of the task. Weeks bled into months, the search narrowing from a furious sprint to a desperate crawl, finally becoming a somber annual ritual. The mountains had won, and the finality of their victory was absolute. The case became a legend, a whispered tale around campfires, the missing 5, their youthful faces captured in grainy photographs, the nervous smile of the leader, the bright, earnest eyes of the lone woman, the confident grin of the youngest member, were tacked to bulletin boards that yellowed over decades. The official conclusion settled on "lost to the elements," a phrase that carried the heavy weight of an unresolved ending. Yet the wilderness holds its secrets, not in simple burial, but in a profound and baffling stillness. No trace means no closure, and it was that lack of evidence that kept a sliver of the initial mystery alive, like a flickering candle in the dark heart of the forest. The story paused, suspended in time, an open wound in the collective memory of the community. But a mountain, however vast, cannot conceal everything forever. The story of the missing 5 was not over. It was merely waiting for a change in the wind, a slight shift in perspective, a 25-year rotation of the earth that would bring a solitary helicopter over a patch of dense, secondary forest, far from the established trails, to find the initial scene of the disappearance preserved with a terrifying and utterly inexplicable clarity. The narrative of a tragic accident was about to be utterly dismantled, replaced by something far more deliberate and infinitely darker. The search was abandoned, but the mystery never truly was. The 25th anniversary of the disappearance arrived like a heavy, unwelcome pall, prompting a fresh, non-official attempt at a search, fueled by the lingering desperation of the surviving family members. A wealthy philanthropist, touched by the enduring tragedy, funded a sophisticated aerial survey, utilizing new thermal and spectral imaging technology that hadn't existed in 1978. It was a shot in the dark, a final expensive gesture against the crushing silence of the decades. The pilot, a man named Robert Klaus, knew the Bitterroot Range intimately, having flown countless timber surveys and search and rescue missions across its spine. He was skeptical, knowing the terrain's capacity for concealment, yet he flew the prescribed grid with methodical focus, his gaze locked on the flickering screens that displayed the raw data. It was on the third day, flying a deep, unexplored drainage miles off the planned route, that the anomaly appeared. Not a heat signature, but a geometrical aberration, a perfectly rectangular, organized shadow beneath the dense canopy, in a place no natural rock formation or old logging debris should have been. Klaus marked the coordinates, a small pinprick of digital data that represented the first meaningful development in a quarter century. The following morning, the ground team, a small, weary collection of volunteers, and a single grizzled sheriff's deputy who remembered the original investigation, hiked in. The coordinates led them not to a dramatic mountain pass, but to a shallow, almost insignificant fold in the lower slopes, a place of thick, secondary growth, the forest floor blanketed by a heavy, obscuring layer of pine needles and damp earth. After hours of hacking through the underbrush, they found it. It was not a body, nor was it a crash site. It was impossibly a camp. The site was so jarringly out of time, so completely contradictory to the official narrative, that the investigators paused at the edge of the clearing, their hearts thudding against the silence of the woods. The tents, two small, brightly colored nylon domes, were still pitched, though faded to pale ghosts of their original hues and softened by a layer of mold. They had collapsed in on themselves, the lightweight aluminum poles having finally buckled under decades of snow. But it was the items scattered around the small cold fire pit that spoke volumes. A rusted, half-empty can of beans, a folding camp chair, its canvas rotted, the aluminum frame still recognizable, a small enamel coffee mug, and perhaps most chillingly, the radio antenna. The club had carried a portable, high-frequency radio, essential for long-range communication. Its main whip antenna, designed to be disassembled, was lying on a flat rock, partially extended, suggesting they had been attempting to make a call or perhaps had just finished one. This was not a campsite hastily abandoned due to an accident. This was a place where 5 people had settled in for the night, fully intending to wake up and continue their journey. The initial theory, death by misadventure, a slip on a sheer face, or an unavoidable natural disaster, shattered instantly, replaced by a cold, unsettling question. Why would 5 experienced climbers, far from their scheduled route and with no sign of struggle, simply vanish from their camp? The sheer lack of human sign, the absence of any blood or scuff marks or dragged weight, was the loudest sound in the forest. It hinted at a disappearance that was sudden, complete, and utterly silent. The investigators, now operating with a grim urgency, began the painstaking process of recovery, the smallest artifact now a potential Rosetta Stone to a 25-year-old crime. The mood was no longer one of search and rescue, but of forensic archaeology. This wasn't a loss. It was a mystery, preserved under the moss and pine needles, waiting for its terrifying conclusion. The camp was a trove of baffling evidence. Every item recovered was a frozen moment in time, meticulously cataloged and transported back to the state lab. The most compelling and most perplexing find lay inside one of the collapsed tents. There were 2 sleeping bags, both unzipped and pulled back, as if their occupants had left them only moments before, yet under the fabric lay no remains. On a small waterproof map case, investigators found the final crucial pieces of equipment. The logbook, its pages warped by moisture but still legible, confirmed their identities and offered a final, mundane entry describing a successful day's hike and a plan to dry their socks by the fire. The time of the last entry was 7:45 p.m. The date was September 18, 1978. What happened after that time was a terrifying void. Next to the logbook lay a battered handheld compass and, crucially, the leader's silver pendant. It was a simple, circular charm, an heirloom he rarely took off. The fact that it was not on his person but left behind in the tent suggested a state of undress, or more disturbingly, a moment of profound, unnatural haste. Why discard an essential item? The analysis of the campsite only deepened the mystery of the complete and utter vacuum of struggle. Forensic experts scoured the soil, analyzed the remnants of the fire, and painstakingly mapped the site. They determined the fire had been small, likely extinguished naturally by the morning dew, indicating the occupants had retired shortly after the logbook entry. There was no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds suggested by ground disturbance, and no blood that the modern forensic tools could detect. This eliminated the most obvious theory: a violent attack by an animal or a chance encounter with a disgruntled hermit. A fight for life, no matter how brief, leaves a signature on the earth. Here, there was only quiet departure. As the case moved from the jurisdiction of a cold case unit to the Major Crimes Task Force, the investigators were forced to confront a narrative that defied logic. 5 adults vanished from the safety of their camp, without a sound, without a trace, in the deep of the night. The sheer impossibility of it was the evidence itself. It was too clean. The new line of inquiry focused on the why and the how, abandoning the where. The analysis of the surrounding vegetation showed no evidence of a vehicular trail or any mass movement of bodies away from the camp. They hadn't walked out. Had they been carried out? By whom? And how was 5 people's worth of weight moved without leaving a single broken twig or scuff mark in the soft forest floor? The sheriff's deputy, who had been on the original 1978 search, brought forth a faded single-page report from a local hunter, dismissed at the time as a crank. The hunter claimed to have seen a small, low-flying aircraft, a strange description for the remote region, flying without lights, not far from the search grid in the early hours of September 19th. It was a detail that would have meant nothing in the chaotic weeks of the initial search, but now filtered through the lens of the abandoned campsite, it suggested a dark, organized operation. Was this not a mountaineering tragedy, but a crime of organized abduction? A terrifying professional operation that had used the vast, indifferent wilderness as its cloak? The emotional weight of this realization was heavy. The families who had for decades mourned an accident now confronted the possibility of a targeted act, a human evil far more chilling than the most savage storm. The complete lack of evidence at the scene was no longer a sign of the mountain's power, but of the meticulous, terrifying efficiency of a perpetrator. The logbook's mundane words and the small silver pendant had spoken their truth. They were alive and well at 7:45 p.m. preparing for sleep. The terrifying unknown lay in the silent, empty hours that followed. The small, low-flying aircraft report became the new focus, shifting the investigation's geographic center from the mountainside to the sky. It was a desperate lead, resting on the hazy recollection of a long-retired hunter. But the alternative that the 5 climbers had simply dematerialized was professionally untenable. Investigators, however, discovered a crucial overlooked piece of information in the National Transportation Safety Board's archives. The crash of a small, unregistered Bell 47 helicopter in an extremely remote, heavily forested area of Idaho, roughly 100 miles due west of the abandoned camp. The crash occurred 2 weeks after the disappearance. The 2-man crew were killed, and the official report attributed the accident to a severe, unexpected downdraft. The wreckage had been salvaged and the case closed, an insignificant tragedy in the backwoods. But the Major Crimes Task Force requested the original forensic files. What they found within those cold, sterile reports was a detail that set the whole decades-old narrative on fire. Inside the scorched cabin of the Bell 47, nestled beneath a collapsed seat and partially shielded from the worst of the fire, was a small rusted piece of metal, an arrowhead. It was not a modern hunting tip, but an ancient, pre-contact artifact of a style specific to the indigenous tribes that once inhabited the Missoula Valley. Why would such an object be found in the wreckage of a modern civilian helicopter that crashed 100 miles away from the climbers' camp? The connection seemed too tenuous, a ridiculous coincidence. Yet the memory of the silver pendant, left behind in the tent, created a dark, unsettling symmetry. The investigators initiated contact with the leader's family once more, focusing their questions on his personal effects. After days of sifting through old storage boxes, his younger sister, now a middle-aged woman worn down by 2 decades of grief, found a single black and white photograph. It was a high school picture of the leader, smiling and pinned to his lapel, barely visible but undeniably present, was a small stone arrowhead. She remembered the story. It was his grandfather's, a prized possession found on an archaeological dig years ago, a piece he always carried for luck. The connection was now concrete, undeniable, and horrific. The arrowhead in the crashed helicopter belonged to the missing climber. The mundane artifact, dismissed by the NTSB as cultural detritus, was the one piece of physical evidence linking the campsite, the aerial sighting, and a fatal crash. The theory of a tragic accident in the mountains dissolved entirely, replaced by the crushing, terrifying weight of a premeditated criminal act. The 5 climbers hadn't been killed by the elements. They had been abducted. By whom and for what purpose remained agonizingly unclear. The crashed helicopter suddenly took on an entirely new significance. It wasn't the vehicle of the abduction, but perhaps the vehicle of the getaway, one that had ultimately failed. The implication was stark. The climbers had survived the initial silent capture at the campsite, only to meet their end in a fiery crash far from home. The emotional tone in the task force shifted from weary resignation to a focused, almost vengeful determination. They weren't looking for bodies anymore. They were looking for a crime scene, one that had been cleaned by the flames and the passage of time. The initial silence of the wilderness was now explained, not by the mountain's indifference, but by the cold, calculated actions of men of flesh and blood. The true story was not one of nature's cruelty, but of human depravity, a narrative infinitely more disturbing. The focus now turned from the victims to the crashed pilot, a man who, in death, was finally about to give up his terrible secrets. The helicopter crash site became the final, brutal focal point of the 25-year investigation. The forensic files, re-examined under the glare of the new evidence, pointed toward a controlled, deliberate environment, not the chaotic setting of a mountaineering camp. The pilot, whose name was Garrett Hale, was a known, though minor, player in a network of illegal timber poaching and high-value artifact smuggling operating throughout the Pacific Northwest. The co-pilot was identified as his associate, a man with a history of minor violent crimes. The motive was still murky, but the profile of the perpetrators now aligned with the facts. Individuals who operated in the vast, untracked spaces of the wilderness, using the mountains as a shield and a sanctuary, and whose activities could justify a sudden, violent encounter with innocent bystanders. The investigators began to reconstruct the final hours of the missing five, a narrative pieced together from cold records and the grim logic of criminal efficiency. The climbers, settling in for a comfortable night, likely encountered Hale and his associate. Perhaps they were spotted performing an illegal operation, or perhaps the climber's presence was simply an unacceptable risk. The silver pendant left behind suggests a rapid, non-violent detainment, likely at gunpoint, preventing any chance of struggle or escape that would have left forensic signs. They were marched silently from their camp, placed aboard the unregistered helicopter, the low-flying aircraft, and flown away, their disappearance orchestrated to look like a mountain accident. The flight path, though speculative, placed the helicopter over the Idaho border 2 weeks later, an impossible gap of time. Where had the five climbers been for those 2 weeks? The horrifying implication was that the delay was not about distance, but about disposal. A new team was dispatched to the original crash site, no longer searching for wreckage, but for a grave site. The area was remote, unforgiving, and exactly the kind of place a professional criminal would choose to eliminate evidence. Weeks of exhaustive, meticulous excavation yielded nothing until a small team, utilizing ground-penetrating radar on a faint, irregular depression near a secluded creek bed, discovered a faint, subterranean anomaly. The digging was slow, painful, and conducted under a heavy cloak of secrecy. The soil was damp, thick with roots, and held its contents stubbornly. Finally, they reached it. Not 5 bodies, but 3. The grim discovery was confirmed through dental records and trace evidence. The remains of 3 of the 5 missing 5, the leader, the woman, and the youngest member, were found in a shallow, hastily dug grave. The horror was compounded by the absence of the other 2. Why 3? The partial answer came from the forensic examination of the recovered remains. The analysis indicated the cause of death was not the fiery crash, which occurred 2 weeks later, but blunt force trauma to the back of the head, a swift, brutal execution with an unknown object. The time of death was determined to be close to the time of their initial disappearance, that silent, terrifying night at the abandoned campsite. The narrative shifted again from abduction to homicide and disposal. Hale and his associate had killed 3 of the climbers, buried them near the creek bed, and then, inexplicably, had either failed to kill the other 2 or had taken them with them. The fact that the arrowhead, the leader's personal talisman, was found in the crashed helicopter suggests that Hale or his associate had kept a piece of the crime, a macabre trophy, before the fatal fiery descent. The final agonizing question now hangs suspended in the vast silence of the wilderness. What terrible fate befell the remaining 2? Were they victims of a separate crime? Were they forced to cooperate with their captors? The evidence, a quarter-century later, had finally yielded a truth more monstrous than any rockslide or blizzard, a truth that replaced the simple tragedy of nature with the complex, enduring terror of human evil. The mountains had kept the secret, but the criminals, in their desperate flight, had left behind the one piece of evidence that brought the entire dark narrative into the devastating light. The mystery of the missing 5 was no longer about a disappearance. It was about unaccounted for victims and unpunished perpetrators. The silence was broken, but the emotional wound remained, now deeper and more poisoned by the knowledge of what truly happened beneath the vast, indifferent sky. The recovery of the 3 sets of remains did not bring the hoped-for closure. Instead, it opened an abyss of new, more unsettling questions centered on the 2 missing individuals, Mark Davies and Eleanor Vance. If the motive was merely to silence witnesses to an illegal operation, why bury 3 bodies and take the remaining 2 alive? This discrepancy was the single, unyielding knot in the final thread of the investigation. The grim work of processing the newly defined crime scene continued. The small creek bed, now illuminated by the harsh scrutiny of the forensic light, yielded one final disturbing artifact: a small, smooth stone, not native to the immediate area, on which was etched a single crude tally mark. It was an act of defiance, a silent communication from a person held captive, a signal of the time they were forced to endure. The stone was found near the perimeter of the burial site, suggesting it was dropped during the horrific act of covering the graves. Investigators deduced it had to have belonged to either Davies or Vance, the 2 climbers unaccounted for. This small stone, this single scratch, provided the devastating insight into the victims' final moments. They were alive and witnessing the execution and burial of their friends. The emotional weight of this realization was paralyzing. The 2 survivors were forced to bear witness to the ultimate betrayal by their captors, a psychological torture designed to break their will. This suggested the crime was not simply about silencing a threat, but about coercion, leverage, or a planned future exploitation. The investigators circled back to the known criminal history of the deceased pilot, Garrett Hale. His records indicated a past association with a minor but geographically widespread criminal network involved not only in smuggling artifacts but also in providing transport and logistics for unidentified high-value human cargo. Illegal immigrants, witnesses in hiding, or, more chillingly, victims of non-consensual transfer. The 2 remaining climbers, fit, young, and clean of any criminal association, now fit a new, darker profile: assets. They were not simply bodies to be disposed of, but currency to be traded. The helicopter crash, 2 weeks later and 100 miles away, was no longer just an accident. It was the failed final stage of an illicit transfer. Hale and his associate were likely transporting the two remaining climbers, Davies and Vance, to a designated location. But their craft had been brought down, perhaps by weather, mechanical failure, or a struggle during the flight. This theory, while speculative, accounted for the 2-week delay and the massive geographical separation between the initial abduction and the final crash. The final push of the investigation focused on the crash site in Idaho, now considered the second and more crucial crime scene. Despite the fire and the previous cursory NTSB investigation, the Major Crimes Task Force conducted a brutal inch-by-inch excavation of the area surrounding the wreckage. The search concluded with the discovery of 2 essential items, half buried in the soil and only revealed through the use of high-resolution metal detectors: a pair of shredded nylon rope restraints and a partially melted wristwatch confirmed to belong to Mark Davies. The restraints indicated that, even in their final moments, the missing climbers were still prisoners. The wristwatch, its hands frozen at a time precisely 1 hour before the official NTSB estimate of the crash, suggested a struggle that may have preceded and even caused the aircraft's fatal descent. Did Davies and Vance, in a final desperate act of defiance and survival, fight their captors in the air, creating the turbulence that brought the helicopter down? It was a final hopeful act in an otherwise hopeless tragedy. Yet, despite the evidence of their final struggle and the near certainty of their involvement in the crash, the bodies of Mark Davies and Eleanor Vance were never found. The dense forest, the crash fire, the 2-week gap, and the unknown fate of the wreckage's contents had created the ultimate, final, heartbreaking void. The case of the missing 5, solved in its horrific details of abduction and murder, remains unresolved in its final chilling act. The families of Davies and Vance now knew that their loved ones had endured an unimaginable ordeal, had fought back, and had likely died in a fiery final battle. But the mountains, in a cruel twist of fate, had reclaimed 2 of their victims utterly, denying their families the one true solace: a body to mourn, a place to finally rest their grief. The story of the 5 young climbers remains a dark, permanent scar on the history of the Bitterroot Range, a testament not to the fury of nature, but to the silence of human cruelty and the profound tragedy of a truth that arrived a quarter century too late. The wilderness, vast and indifferent, had simply allowed the initial lie to persist, only to reveal a far darker reality when the time was right.